It's been quite a while since I last did an episode of Unsung Heroes on the channel, so what better way of coming back than with a bang, with a car that's simultaneously badass and kinda dumb at the same time, which simultaneously makes total sense that it didn't reach production, but at the same time would have been pretty damn cool if it did. And it is, of course, as you'll have seen from the title, the Corvette ZR-12. That's not a misprint, it's the experimental vehicle number 5664, or as the internal engineers at Chevy called it at the time, the Conan Corvette. Now, within the Corvette fandom, it's a pretty well-known car, so you might have heard of this one before, but we're going to get into what the story is here, and really talk about what could have been, maybe even till this day in some ways, the ultimate Corvette. Now, back in the 80s, especially the late 80s, Chevy and Ford got wind of a vehicle coming out which was going to eclipse their top performance models. Ford with the Mustang, and Chevy with, of course, America's premier affordable supercar or sports car or super sports car, depending on how you want to look at it, the Corvette. Now, the ZR1 was a fantastic car for its time, based, of course, on a C4 platform, 375 to 405 horsepower, really good performance, really good price, and a little bit more technical than what came to be its best rival. Of course, the Viper. To this day, the arguably ultimate byword for excessive engines, even though it's not even in production anymore, and both Ford in that recent episode of this series with the V10 Mustang and Chevrolet with this car wanted to get in on that game. This kind of hot rod meets sports car idea, which was just going to completely overshadow their vehicles, if in no other way than bragging rights. With that in mind, some Chevy engineers managed to convince the bean counters, using primarily the argument of testing the limitations and the stresses, etc., of the current platform that they were working with in the ZR1, to make a Viper tier Corvette, in terms of being excessive, not necessarily just in terms of performance, something which was as impressive on paper as it was in practice. And what they did is they went to an Arizona-based engine tuning brand, a race engine builder, called Ryan Falconer Racing Engines. The Falconer V12, in particular, was the engine that they chose, an aluminium block used in a number of applications from hot rods to marine or even aero engines, and this engine is nothing short of a beast. Now, it's based in part on the small block Chevy motor, but it's a 600 cubic inch V12. That's a 9.8 litre, putting out, some say 600 horses, some say as high as 680, and 680 foot-pounds of torque. Bonkers numbers for a 1989-based Corvette, which is the model year that this one was built on. Now, by today's standards, those are still very healthy for a supercar, but back then, that was monumentally powerful. In fact, that's more powerful than the McLaren F1 would be a couple of years later, which is pretty insane when you think of it that way. Now, they tested the vehicle, and it sounded magnificent. There's actually some footage, I believe, online that you can find of it, and it has been covered by some other people as well. But the performance would have doubtless been earth-shattering from that kind of power. Interestingly, to fit that engine in the car, though, they had to make the whole thing 8 inches longer than it already was, which you might be able to tell from some of the images, but I think the car actually wears that very well. It has a shape that naturally leans into that kind of extra length and extra design, much like the Viper itself does, so I think it suits the Corvette to be that kind of size. Aside from that, it was essentially still, interior-wise, etc., still a ZR1. So it was still a car that was just that close to being production, but they had two real issues. One of them was cooling, and the second was, of course, the kind of prices that they'd have to charge to develop and produce this as a production vehicle. The whole point of the Corvette, to go back to it, was to be an attainable supercar, attainable sports car. This would have put it into actual supercar territory, which again would have kind of missed the point of going up against the Viper. So unfortunately, due to a combination of pricing itself out of relevance and those aforementioned cooling issues, the ZR-12 didn't quite reach production, and it then went to spend some of its life in the General Motors Heritage Collection, and then more recently in the National Corvette Museum, wherein of course it was loaned to them by Chevrolet themselves. One of the most remarkable things about the car overall, though, despite all of that crazy engine, crazy power and torque, even the additional size, it's actually only about 100 pounds heavier than the ZR1 already was, which is quite remarkable. In fact, it's only around a 1,600 kilo car, which I believe is about £3,500, something like that, maybe a little bit more if you do the conversion. So ultimately, this really would have been a Godzilla Corvette, and why they called it the Conan Corvette is obvious. It is an absolute beast. It would have blown the Viper out of the water, that's for sure, but if nothing else, it almost aimed a little bit too high, and as I alluded to at the start of the video, really was a case of bringing a nuke to a gunfight, or in this case more like a nuke to a fistfight. Ultimately, the Viper retained the most badass engine crown, but the Corvette in its own right certainly didn't suffer in sales in the long run, and has the last laugh now since it's actually still around and the Viper isn't. Ultimately though, that's it for this installment of Unsung Heroes. Of course, give me your thoughts on this episode and on the car if you like it or not. And if you want to vote on this being one of your favourite episodes, of course you can jump over to the Discord chat for the channel, linked right below, and vote for this car or any of the other episodes here on the channel. And as you can see from the thumbnail, there are quite a few episodes to watch if you're new here. But until next time, I'll see you then. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.